Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Setrag Manoukian. I am the chair of the Anthropology department here at McGill. And it is my honor and pleasure to welcome you all to this event. An event which is taking place on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. McGill University honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet today. We're gathered here to honor and remember the life of Richard Salisbury, who devoted a good portion of his career, and maybe more than his career, to the indigenous peoples of the places we now today call Quebec and Canada. I welcome and thank the Salisbury family for making this event possible and for renewing their generosity towards our department and McGill University. Let's also recognize that we meet at the Red Path Museum, a museum which, with its building and its displays, is perhaps the most iconic McGill landmark of this often fractured and difficult history of the encounters between these lands and different people, animals, plants, minerals from here and from elsewhere. We thank the Red Path for their hospitality. And today we're honoring Richard Salisbury's professional contribution with a lecture by Professor James Ferguson, one of the most esteemed contemporary anthropologists and critical thinkers. I do welcome Professor Ferguson. Before Professor Ferguson's lecture, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Antonia Maioni, will inaugurate the event, followed by our colleague, Professor Colin Scott, who will offer a portrait of Richard Salisbury, and our own student, Rihan, who will introduce Professor Ferguson. After the lecture, there will be a reception upstairs to which you're all invited, and where you will have a chance to also visit part of the museum and a new display of Richard Salisbury collection. Let me conclude by thanking all the institutions and the people who have contributed to this initiative. First of all, our co-sponsors, the Center for the CICADA, the Center for Indigenous Conservation and Development Initiatives, its director, Professor Colin Scott, its administrator, Lucia Justo, the Dean of Arts Development Fund, and as well as Professor Peter Johansen from the Department of Anthropology, Sarah Lucasen from the Development Office in the Faculty of Arts, Erin Hansen and Shamin Moradoun from the Administrative Hub to which our department belongs, Annie Lucia, who is a curator here at the Red Path Museum, and Jeanette de Soro, who is the administrative coordinator. But most of all, let me thank our Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Antonia Maioni, who is here with us and who's been supporting and promoting this initiative from the beginning, and to which now I invite to come here to inaugurate the reinstated Richard Salisbury Memorial Lecture Series. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Setrag. That was a great introduction. I'm very happy to be here at the Red Path Museum to speak to all of you this afternoon. And this is more than a full house. As you know, this used to be the medical lecture hall. And you have just about filled it to the rafters. So that's a great showing of support for Richard Salisbury and for the lecture in his name. I would like to first welcome the members of the Salisbury family who are here with us this evening. Tom Salisbury, graduate of McGill, and his wife Kathy, also graduate of McGill, along with Catherine Salisbury, who's here with us from Nova Scotia. They represent the family this afternoon, and although Mary Salisbury was unable to join us, we're thinking of her this afternoon. Richard Salisbury joined McGill a long time ago, long before I arrived, and I'm suspecting long before most of the people in this room arrived at McGill. He actually came to McGill in Montreal in 1962, and he was one of the founders of the Department of Anthropology and one of its first chairs from 1966 to 1970. But Professor Salisbury was someone who, I guess one of the ways of putting it would be, he was someone who was ahead of his time. He was concerned with Indigenous representation, with sustainability, with the environment, all the things that are the hallmark of the Department of Anthropology's research and training today. Professor Salisbury was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 1974 for his contributions to Canadian anthropology. He was co-founder and director of McGill's Centre for Developing Area Studies, which is now a thriving institute, and has a teaching program of over 800 undergraduates in the Faculty of Arts. He also served on the board of the Canadian Human Rights Foundation. He was a member of a very important Quebec Commission on Higher Education in 1977, and he became Honorary Secretary of the Royal Society of Canada's Academy of Humanities and Social Sciences. Professor Salisbury also occupied the position that I have today. He was the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, unfortunately only for a short time between 1986 and 1989. It was also a particularly difficult time. It was a time of real fiscal limitations. And so he, as Dean, sought any potential opportunity to develop the faculty and worked consistently with departments to make them grow. And what we have from his legacy are things that matter, not only to McGill, but to Canada and the world. Our current Indigenous initiatives at McGill and in the Faculty of Arts can be considered, I think, in part, a long-term outcome and a legacy of Dean Salisbury's efforts. The other legacy is that the Salisbury family have long been supporters of McGill and the discipline of anthropology. Their generation has supported numerous undergraduate students over the years through the Richard F. Salisbury Prize in Anthropology and the Howard E. Roseborough Prize in Sociology. With their most recent gift, the Salisbury family has renewed their connection with the department and faculty and have made it possible to revitalize the Richard F. Salisbury Memorial Lecture. The lecture series is, in fact, a special tribute to the life of Dr. Salisbury and a wonderful opportunity to bring our university's distinguished scholars, many of whom are with us this afternoon, to join as a community to celebrate their predecessor and the founder of the department. These lectures will greatly enrich academic life on McGill's campus, while also drawing attention to the relevance of anthropology in addressing contemporary questions. And certainly our guest speaker, Professor Ferguson, has done just that, and is still doing just that, In addition, I'm really happy that we're having this lecture here at the Red Path Museum because the Salisbury family have recently donated to this museum a series of artifacts that were collected by Professor Salisbury in the 1950s and 1960s in Papua New Guinea. And so, in fact, I think his son actually remembers that time, and certainly Mary Salisbury, his wife, was a partner in that journey and in that adventure. So the artifacts, there are new artifacts that will enrich the collection already donated by the family to the museum in 2003. So I hope when you move upstairs to the reception, you'll take a look at these objects in a beautiful new display, an exhibit on the third floor of the museum. And I don't know how many of you have children, but I've spent many happy afternoons in this museum with my children as well. So I'd like to thank Mary Salisbury, and also Catherine and Tom. Thank you very much for this newest addition to our collection here and to your generous contribution to the Richard F. Salisbury Lecture Series. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to my distinguished colleague, Professor Colin Scott from the Department of Anthropology, who will give us a little bit more information and I'm sure a lot of reminiscences about Richard F. Salisbury and his contributions to anthropological research. Thank you very much once again for being here.
Forgive me if I'm squinting occasionally at my notes because I've left my reading glasses at home. It's a real honor to have this opportunity to attempt to summarize in a few minutes the scholarly contributions of Dick Salisbury. Not least because I had the enormous privilege and advantage of Dick's supervision for my master's and PhD studies. Dick was the author or co-author of 20 books, monographs, and reports, and more than 60 articles. He was a great example of academic devotion and productivity for his many students, including more than 30 graduate students over the course of his career, who have, along with Dick's own work, have shaped in particular the face of Canadian anthropology quite profoundly. Dick was one of the founding members and a very active advocate of the formation of the Canadian Anthropology Society, CASCA, and missed no opportunity to engage those of us who were his students in that undertaking. The scope of his intellectual project was very broad. Economics and politics of development, a transactional approach to kinship and social structure, to language, the social process of myth-making, remarkably in advance of its time when he wrote about it in the 1960s, mid-1960s, and an applied anthropology dedicated to making research relevant to decision-making in the world beyond academia. His motif was, one of his motifs was the anthropologist as honest broker. No matter how polarized the positions of actors in a given situation, Dick wanted them to talk it through, and wanted to talk it through with them all, and to explore the possibilities for common ground. This perspective resulted in part on his borrowing from game theory and an interest in non-zero-sum games, in which, to quote him, there was an outcome that could make everyone better off. His commitment to ethnography was profound. He maintained that bad theory was the result of bad theory. Bad theory was the result of bad fieldwork, first and foremost. His weaving of richly grounded ethnography into nuanced theory is seen throughout the corpus of his work. First in the monographs resulting from his work in New Guinea. The two signal works that come to mind are From Stone to Steel, Economic Consequences of a Technological Change in New Guinea, 1962, with the Siani of the New Guinea Highlands. And then in 1970, he produced Vunamami, Economic Transformation in a Traditional Society, among Tolai in New Britain. His approach to economic anthropology focused on actors' decision-making where scarce resources are allocated between competing ends. And this approach moved away from the dominant structural functional perspective of his early career toward a transactional approach. Dick staked out a middle ground between formalist and substantivist anthropological economics, insisting that the interaction of individual decision makers with regulatory institutions and structures must always be held in view. This led to an emphasis on generative processes, on social actors with diverse interests, who everywhere face the similar problem of making decisions under a variety of constraints. This transactional approach also informed Dick's work on kinship. In his early monographs, Dick backgrounds the relationship of kinship structure to first evoke for the reader the perspective from the ground of local actors. In the words of one of his students who contributed to a volume about Dick's work, a child's eye view of the concrete experiences of learning how to feel and what to think about members of her or his own clan. The social genesis of love, respect, and other sentiments, which was not at all common or typical in that period, but which has become a very important current in anthropology today. His work on mythology was similarly forward-looking. It focused on the generation of mythical narrative over sometimes very short periods of time, as few as a few days. Full-blown mythical narrative could emerge, and Dick documented how this happened in the context of his own fieldwork. So while he acknowledged the structural principles which bestowed legitimacy on the claims made by actors through their narrative creations, he also was very attuned to the agency of individuals and the creativity of individuals in these culturally structured contexts. Dick's signature applied work flowed from research conducted after he came to McGill, in particular from the early 1970s, alongside his graduate students, initially with the Federal Provincial Task Force on the James Bay Hydroelectric Project. That event persuaded Dick of the importance of really bringing the best of anthropological knowledge and other disciplinary knowledge to the problem of human rights, of environmental impacts, as Antonia has alluded to. Impacting a region of mostly Cree territory in an area, in a part of Quebec about the size of France geographically. And he documents this, a decade of this development in a book, A Homeland for the Cree, Regional Development in James Bay from 1971 to 1981, which was published in 1986. He explains the conditions which permit indigenous self-sustained development, not classic development in terms of gross national product and all of the other conventional measures, but an understanding of locally and regionally self-determined development. He always emphasized in our conversations, in his seminars, the importance of bringing social action and responsibility for collective decisions to the lowest feasible scale of social organization. But at the same time nesting that within the broader parameters of the state. He emphasized the need for regional political solidarity and wider alliance, and the need to actively oppose adverse power structures, sometimes even in quite confrontational ways, which didn't strike me as characteristic of Dick, confrontation, but I was very interested. On one occasion, after I became involved in work with the Crees, we were in a situation where some of the Cree leadership were being reluctant to take up a challenge to a certain project on Cree territory. And Dick said to me, and it surprised me. I should give some background to why it surprised me, because I came to McGill as a kind of I was really into neo-Marxism. And that for Dick was a little bit too much like macro theory, grand theory. He didn't dismiss some of the truths of Marxism, but he was much more interested in what was happening on the ground and what you could actually do pragmatically And I don't think he got the point of quite a lot of Marxist theory where he didn't see that the opportunity to actually engage locally. So I thought of Dick as a quite malleable, kind of liberal individual, and he quite forcefully said, I'll phone those guys and tell them they have to confront this. So I realized that part of his pragmatism was about dealing with stubborn structures, and doing so forcefully, but always with the idea of coming back to a possibility of negotiation. Establish a position of strength and then negotiate for that common ground, that non-zero-sum common ground. And that was a kind of relationship that developed between the Crees of Iuistsi and the government of Quebec and the government of Canada, thanks in part to a philosophy that Dick promoted, and one that was also quite compatible with Cree's own understandings of how to do politics. So just to summarize, I want to quote the late Marilyn Silverman, one of Dick's many accomplished students. She says, his theoretical contributions were immense, his ethnographic insights irreplaceable, and his legacy through and to his discipline and students profound. I couldn't think of truer words, unless perhaps to remember the words of a Cree colleague and a student at McGill at the time that Dick got involved in this work, Philip Owashish, and we invited Philip to this event, and sadly Philip is in Hawaii at the moment for a friend's wedding, but he's one of the senior statesmen of the Cree, one of the 2 or 3 most prominent individuals, and at Dick's memorial service many years ago on this campus, Philip Owashish gave one of the eulogies. And I think that he struck a very interesting note that is pertinent to our continuing struggles as settler colonialists in relation with First Nations. Philip paid Dick, I think, the highest honor when referring to a lesson that Philip had learned from his father, who was a highly respected Cree elder, hunter, a person who spent his life on the land. And Philip said, my father told me that all honorable men belong to the same tribe. And Dick Salisbury was an honorable man. And I've always remembered those words. I now want to turn to Rihan Lewis to introduce James Ferguson, our distinguished presenter, for this inaugural Salisbury Memorial Lecture. And Rihan is currently a master's student in the Department of Anthropology and was a recipient of the Department of Anthropology's Salisbury Prize in 2018 for her honors thesis, Getting There, traveling to access abortion services in Texas. So we're particularly delighted that she is able to contribute to today's event. Rihan, please take the podium.
Is the sound all right? Great. Thank you so much, Colin, and of course thank you also to the department and to the other organizers of this event, and especially, most of all, to the Salisbury family for their tremendous support of the Department of Anthropology and its students over so many years now. So for the inaugural Salisbury Memorial Lecture, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our speaker. We're so fortunate to be joined here tonight by James Ferguson. Professor Ferguson is the Susan S. and William H. Hindle Professor in the School of Humanities and Sciences, and also Professor in the Department of Anthropology at Stanford University. Prior to this appointment, he was the chair of the Department for Anthropology and director for the Critical Theory Institute, I believe, at UC Irvine. Professor Ferguson is, of course, quite widely known for his contributions to the anthropology of development, and in particular, his dedication to exploring a critical understanding of how these politics of development impact the day-to-day lives of the people positioned as subjects within development projects. Within this field of research, Professor Ferguson has published innumerable articles, and I believe it's 4 monographs, the most recent of which received the Elliott P. Skinner Prize from the Association of Africanist Anthropology. More recently, Professor Ferguson's work has focused on the emergence of direct cash transfer programs in the Global South as a form of social welfare that he interprets within a specific politics of distribution. So tonight, Professor Ferguson's lecture expands on this concept by discussing emergent forms of resource distribution that actually undermine older systems of provision through wage labor, creating instead a distributive context in which Ferguson posits ownership and presence as the grounds on which people make distributive claims. So thank you so much. I'm so pleased to introduce Professor Ferguson. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I never knew Richard Salisbury, and until recently, I must say, I had only a passing familiarity with his work, which of course didn't much touch on Africa. But I realized in preparing for this lecture that I feel an odd kind of kinship with him. In part, I think this is because what I know of Salisbury's work and career reminds me so much of my own first teacher of anthropology, David Brokenshaw, who passed away just a couple of years ago. Born within a few years of each other, they had strikingly similar intellectual interests and commitments, and also some of the same intellectual virtues, including what I think of as a kind of intellectual humility and a deep commitment to empirical fieldwork. They were part of a pioneering generation of anthropologists who broke away before it was fashionable from static accounts of so-called peoples without history and insisted on the centrality of what was at first called social change, later sometimes development anthropology. Today, I am tempted to say that we might call it simply anthropology. Though work in those areas did not enjoy a terribly high status back in the day when the discipline was dominated by a kind of ahistorical butterfly collecting, as Edmund Leach once famously put it. Today, we can recognize this pioneering work as a kind of bridge to the future, and the social change scholars from that period as cherished ancestors. Figures with whom we may still have our disagreements and troubles, as one always does with the ancestors, but with whom we maintain a living connection of gratitude and respect. So even though I never knew Richard Salisbury, I do feel this sort of indirect connection with him, which makes me especially pleased and honored to have been asked to present this lecture here today. In recent years, I have been working on a topic that I feel sure Dick Salisbury would have engaged with vigor, what I call the politics of distribution. By the politics of distribution, I mean most simply the political question of who gets what and why. And the claim that I wish to make here is that labor and citizenship, long the anchors for our thinking about these questions of distribution, no longer provide an adequate way of answering them. Both in my own area of specialization in Southern Africa and across the Global South and beyond, the old answers leave out huge populations. As Tanya Lee and I have argued in a recent paper, growing masses of unemployed and underemployed and the rapid expansion of precarious and so-called informal livelihoods challenge the idea of universal inclusion through integration into a stable formal sector workforce, a world of so-called proper jobs. Meanwhile, an increasingly mobile global population leaves growing numbers all over the world undocumented, and thus lacking citizenship rights in their places of work and residence. At the same time, I will argue here, emergent new forms of distributive politics show the importance of different kinds of distributive claims in these times. Claims based on neither labor nor citizenship, but on what we might call, in the broadest sense, ownership on the one hand, and what I term presence on the other. I will explain these rather cryptic terms, ownership and presence, shortly. But let me start by reviewing very briefly those long-established old distributive ideals, grounded in labor and citizenship. And here I refer back briefly to that paper I mentioned that I did with Tanya Lee. With respect to the labor side of the story, all across the world, a kind of meta-narrative of economic progress promised, as a culmination of the development process, the universalization of waged or salaried employment. A modern society was a society of jobs and job holders. That this promise has so often ended up a broken one does not diminish its attraction, as is clear in the rhetorical appeals of politicians the world over. Jobs, jobs, jobs. But the limited ability to think beyond this promised land of jobs for all afflicts not only politicians, but scholars as well. Indeed, the proper job has served for so long as a presumed norm or telos of development that we are too often left with a stunted and reactive set of categories and concepts for thinking about all the other ways in which people make their ways in the world. This is perhaps why discussions of so-called precarity so often rely on residual categories of analysis: unemployment, informal economy, non-standard employment, instability, insecurity. Categories that render everything outside the world of jobs a kind of negative space, defined by that which it is not. There was a powerful vision implicit in the idea of an emerging developed world in which paid labor might provide the basis both of a stable livelihood and of a kind of social membership or incorporation for all. As people left their pre-industrial, rural, agricultural, or pastoral livelihoods in such a conception, they would be fitted into the modern new social order precisely by having a job, that enchanted object that still provides the normal answer to the question, so what do you do? A set of gendered expectations about the breadwinner and the family, the organization of time and space, the role of formal education, respectability and virtue, and contribution to the nation, all were rolled together into this notion of the proper job. Today, as that imagined universality gradually recedes into the rearview mirror, its once dominant status begins to become visible to us as distinctive, perhaps even strange. As Guy Standing once memorably put it, the 20th century, in retrospect, now appears as what he called the century of laboring man, a time when the lifeway of what had been a small fraction of the population, the stabilized urban working class, became quite suddenly, and somehow for many quite convincingly, projected as the future of all. And if the century of laboring man is, as Standing argues, at an end, it is not because stable waged and salaried labor is disappearing in any absolute sense, but because it is losing its probability, its plausibility, as the universal solution, the obvious telos of a worldwide developmental process. Whether due to the globalization of supply chains and labor markets that undercuts established working classes, the persistent structural unemployment and casualization induced by neoliberal restructuring and so-called austerity, or the recent and looming technological developments that threaten to eliminate or drastically reduce whole categories of paid labor, the old transition story no longer convinces. One effect of this lost conviction is the apparently worldwide contemporary anxiety about jobs and the social and economic stability they were long expected to anchor. The anxiety springs from a perception that increasing proportions of the population across much of the world can no longer rely upon, perhaps no longer even plausibly hope for, the sort of stable waged or salaried labor that has long counted as the proper job. And this worry is not confined to poor countries, where whole populations may appear as surplus to the needs of capital. In rich industrialized countries too, the loss of manufacturing jobs and general economic insecurity also raise the specter of what Michael Denning has termed wageless life. Some of this anxiety is about raw unemployment. But even more pervasive is the sense of insecurity and uncertainty evoked by the now widespread term precarious, an adjective that today finds surprisingly broad application across regions and social classes. The term's wide application is surely simply mistaken if it is meant to suggest a single shared set of substantive economic conditions, as if a freelance computer programmer in Silicon Valley and a shack-dwelling casual laborer in Lusaka are somehow part of the same unitary precariat, as some seem to suggest. But for my purposes here, what is significant about precarity is the way that it surfaces a set of issues that go far beyond purely economic ones. Just as jobs were never only about money, the anxiety I reference here is not just about the loss of income or the threat of falling into absolute poverty, but also about the wider implications of increasing casualization, subcontracting, freelancing, improvising, all the flexibility, uncertainty, and short-termism that so undermines the real or imagined certainties and temporalities of that old breadwinner world. The anxiety is thus not just about paychecks, but equally about issues of identity, gender, and family, national membership, and so on, that were long anchored by the social ideal of the proper job. Indeed, in the political domain, the nation-state has long provided the same sort of anchor of stability that the proper job was supposed to offer in the economic domain. A legally authorized political membership, in theory at least, underpinned a set of explicit and universal rights and obligations. And this, too, helps provide the answer to that central question of distributive politics. Who gets what and why? If income in labor terms was seen as a reward for work, there always remained the question of all those who did not, in those terms, work. That is, those unable to work or whose work was not paid. Society being composed not of individuals, but of domestic groups, often understood in highly idealized terms as families, legitimate dependence was part of the distributive story. In this old story, children, old people, and often reproductive women as well, were styled as legitimate dependents, dependent upon the worker, the breadwinner, the head of household. But there were also others unable to work, due to disability, for instance, or to the unemployment produced by the unpredictable vacillations of the business cycle. And here the nation-state stepped into the spotlight, especially in the form of so-called welfare states that, where they existed, offered a different kind of legitimate dependence in the form of direct social payments to the poor and the provision of a so-called safety net. Social assistance, perhaps the purest instance of direct state intervention into distributive outcomes, here was pegged directly to the two anchors of distributive politics I have identified. First, it was generally available not to workers, but specifically to dependents, children, the elderly, the disabled, the reproductive woman. A kind of photographic negative of the laboring man, that breadwinner, able-bodied worker. And it was available, again, nearly always only to citizens, as a kind of solidarity appropriately extended only to those within the charmed circle of national membership. My argument here, to put it in a highly condensed form, is that this whole way of thinking about distribution has less and less purchase today, both in Southern Africa and in much of the rest of the world, as increasing proportions of people fall out of both the labor and the citizenship frames of inclusion. These include the surging new urban masses who don't gain their livelihoods either from working the land, they are no longer peasants, or by selling their labor, they cannot become workers, but instead pursue what I have termed distributive livelihoods. That is, livelihoods that depend not on selling one's labor, but on accessing the income streams of others via social or political claims. Those falling out of the frame also include those who, with or without access to paid labor, are unable to access citizenship-based forms of distribution, including social protection, due to migration and the associated lack of documents. The so-called illegals, who in Southern Africa and elsewhere comprise an increasingly large share of the poor, but who as residents but not citizens lack political rights and distributive entitlements alike. Given these increasingly hard to ignore gaps in the world's systems of distributive allocation, I wish to pose the question of what other grounds, what other legitimate principles or political arguments, beyond those rooted in labor and citizenship, are available to support new sorts of distributive claims. What new ways are emerging for answering the old questions, who gets what and why? Here I point to two broad areas of emergence. One, what I call claims of ownership, comes from my own recent work in the monograph Give a Man a Fish. The other, involving the claims of what I call presence, is something I am now trying to work out in a new, still in progress paper, brief excerpts from which I will include in what follows. With respect to what I'm calling ownership, I begin by observing that even those who are partly or wholly excluded from the world of productive labor may still make strong distributive claims by styling themselves as members of a collectivity understood as a rightful or ultimate sort of owner. Marxism, with its labor theory of value and its fundamental understanding of the oppressed as workers, has always struggled with the politics of the non-worker, the so-called lumpen masses, as Marx put it, excluded from the putatively revolutionary class of wage laborers. But I suggested in Give a Man a Fish that we are heir to a rich set of alternative left traditions that may have more to offer to those excluded from a role in the production system. The anarcho-communist Peter Kropotkin, for instance, always insisted on starting with universal claims of distribution and a notion of distributive justice ultimately rooted in societal membership and not just labor. Where does our vast wealth come from? Why are we so much more productive than our great-grandparents? We are not better people than they were. We certainly do not work harder. Instead, we are able to produce vast riches they could not have dreamt of, only thanks to a vast worldwide industrial apparatus of production, an apparatus built up through generations of work, sacrifice, and invention across centuries and even millennia of human history, in a process that generated massive suffering for millions all across the globe. And to whom does this vast wealth-producing apparatus really belong? Surely not only to the corporate stockholders, who now outrageously claim to own it outright, but to the descendants of all those who worked and imagined and suffered and bled to create it. In short, to all of us. The whole system of production in this conception must be regarded as a collective inheritance. And from this universal claim of common ownership, Kropotkin derives a universal distributive claim. Surely at least some portion of the entire output must be due to each and every one of the rightful owners of the apparatus of production. Everyone, that is, must receive a share, since everyone is a co-owner. Note that it is not the worker as worker whose claims are prioritized here, but the member of society, the inheritor of a great common estate in which each and every one of us has a share. It is not just labor that founds that inheritance in this view, but also things like suffering, bloodshed, ingenuity, and shared experience. It is therefore the entire society that is the source of value. And it is all members of that society, and not only those currently employed as workers, who as inheritors and co-owners of the whole are entitled to a rightful share of society's proceeds. Such arguments I have shown elsewhere are not only of academic interest. As I showed in Give a Man a Fish, remarkably similar arguments have been put forward by advocates for Namibia's basic income grant campaign, who propose that each and every Namibian should be entitled to a monthly cash payment precisely because they, as the nation's citizens, are the real owners of the country and its substantial mineral wealth. They therefore ought, as they say, to share in the country's wealth. Receipt of a modest monthly state payment in these arguments is rendered simply as the receipt of a share that is properly due to an owner. The most basic citizenship right is thus understood not as the right to vote, but as the right to partake in the wealth of the nation. Direct grants from the state in this understanding need not bring with them the shame or stigma of receiving charity or getting a so-called handout. In receiving a rightful share, Namibian citizens in this conception are simply partaking in a wealth that rightly belongs to the whole nation. And in doing so, they, as rightful co-owners of that wealth, are not receiving a gift or being offered help. They are claiming what is already rightfully their own, a rightful share. But such arguments about shares and sharing, however powerful, are founded upon their own form of exclusion, insofar as they are based upon membership in a bounded collectivity, the nation institutionally represented by the state. And this is linked to the second set of problems I identified at the start. In a highly mobile world, many of the poorest members of many national populations today are those who lack most completely the protections offered by the state, since they're non-citizens. This raises a key question. On what basis other than shared national membership might a distributive obligation, an obligation to share, rest? I tried to begin to address this question in a new paper now in progress, via an argument about what I call presence. Here I very briefly summarize one part of that paper. Reviewing the anthropological literatures on sharing, I find something quite general about the obligation to share. In the most basic possible terms, I observe that we find such an obligation specifically when the person whose claim to a share might or might not be honored is both one of us, what I call the attribute of membership, and here among us, what I call the attribute of presence. Okay, so your claim to to be owed a share is strongest when you are both one of us, what I call membership, and here among us, what I call presence. My observation is that one of these attributes without the other may have some force, but never the full force that comes with both membership and presence. This distinction between criteria of membership and those of presence is, I think, clarifying, and I spend some time in the full-length paper of, trying to show that. But a quick turn to Southern Africa also reveals how these two principles may be brought together in a more dynamic way than Western observers are used to, as presence and membership there often sit in a much more fluid relationship. In European societies, blood and soil have long served as principles of exclusion, such that one may be expelled or excluded either for having the wrong descent, blood, or for being born in the wrong place, soil. But Southern African societies are, in the longue durée, if not always at present, historically disinclined to kick out foreigners and highly sophisticated at devising means for incorporating them as what anthropologists of Africa have called wealth in people. And in the service of securing such wealth, they have traditionally had a more supple and lively conception of how belonging may be linked to both territory, including soil, and bodily substances, including blood. Over time, foreigners have often been held to become durably attached to a place through things like labor, as their sweat mingles with the soil, and suffering, as shared suffering and spilled blood creates a spiritual unity rooted in the lived experience of co-dwelling. Here it is not juridical citizenship that is at issue, where were you born, who were your parents, but the material entailments of shared physical presence, suffering through the same drought, sweating into the same soil. Being here, in this long political tradition, counts for a lot. And over time, such physical presence actually becomes both a kind of membership and an identity of substance. A neighbor is therefore a position from which strong claims can emerge. A gifted Zambian ethnographer, Patience Mususa, has recently given a fine example of this from her fieldwork on the Copper Belt in Zambia. Having purchased for her own use a fixer-upper house in an urban neighborhood of Luanshya, Mususa was soon approached by a neighborhood man who asked if he and his family might move into a spare room at the back of her property, on the understanding that his wife would in exchange serve as a domestic worker. The ethnographer politely declined and explained that she did not need a domestic worker and did not intend to rent out the room. But when she took possession of the house a few weeks later, she found that the family had simply moved in. Her outrage was quickly checked, though, by the reactions of her neighbors, who asked her just what then she did intend to do with that room. In their eyes, she realized to have an unoccupied building would have been, as she puts it, too selfish indeed, and she reluctantly let the family stay. In a similar incident, she reported finding one day, upon her return home from work, two strange women helping themselves to some vegetables she had planted in her back garden. Unperturbed, the women cheerfully shouted, "We are just stealing some vegetables from your garden." Surely, the ethnographer reflected, living alone, I could not have eaten all the vegetables in the garden. Such helpings, as she calls them, were not only common, they were in a real way, in her words, deemed acceptable. As Thomas Vidlock has rightly insisted, among the most important modalities of sharing must be reckoned the practice of, as he puts it, refraining from interfering with someone who is about to take something. This is the logic of what anthropologists call demand sharing, and the rightfulness of the share is here rooted precisely in the simple presence of adjacency, the fact of being here, the status of being a neighbor. Yet the power of this social and political logic of presence, I suggest, remains significantly underanalyzed. Even as what I have called the membership principle, one of us, is both explicitly acknowledged in law as citizenship and endlessly subject to critical analysis as the politics of identity, the presence principle, here among us, has largely remained at the level of common sense. We have not yet fully realized either how central it is to enabling actual feelings of social obligation, or how richly constructed is the apparently self-evident condition of being present, of being here. What might be gained, then, from a conceptual and political reworking of the idea of presence as the basis for a modern-day politics of sharing? Answering this question poses the challenge of moving from the sort of literal face-to-face presence that we see in that Copperbelt neighborhood to a reworked and scaled-up concept more suitable to modern distributive politics. An obligation to share is most readily grasped at the micro level of personal interaction, and we have a harder time imagining how it might be applied to larger scales. But why is this? And why do we so easily imagine membership, in contrast, as capable of being scaled up even to hundreds of millions of people, as in the idea of national citizenship uniting people in a way that is analogous to membership in a family? The task here, as I see it, is to develop a better sense of what a similarly scaled up conception of presence looks like, and to identify modes of distributive politics that might be able to harness the claims of presence to press for specific distributive ends. Ways of insisting that the fact of being here, citizen or not, must be made to have more bearing on the old question of who gets what and why. Where can we find such a politics? In fact, I suggest that recent anthropological work on urban politics already points towards some key points of emergence for such a politics. A politics that is less about membership and legal rights and more about co-presence and its practical struggles and challenges. As Partha Chatterjee once pointed out, practical imperatives of governance often mean that legal certainties of citizenship and rights give way to other logics entailed in the day-to-day management and administration of populations, which, as he puts it, involves less the representation of citizens than the government of what he calls denizens. Glimpses of such an emergent politics can be seen in some recent anthropological work on infrastructure and urban environments in Africa. Here we find political problem spaces of government within which urban residents are drawn together, not just as fellow citizens linked by language, culture, or abstract membership in a nation, but as co-users of an urban infrastructure. Antina von Schnitzler's ethnography of urban water distribution in South Africa, for instance, traces a politics in which ideas of citizenship and rights are central to struggles around payment for water. But the stage for these struggles was set by an earlier episode in which the state committed to a form of universal provision to all residents of a basic minimum of free water. This was not originally granted. Early attempts to collect water fees were eager to deny water to those who didn't, as some said, deserve it, that is, non-citizens, and those who would not or could not pay. But this strategy came crashing down once its consequences became clear in the form of a cholera epidemic. Those cut off from the municipal water system, it turns out, found their own solutions, drawing water from nearby fetid ditches and pools. And before long, it became clear that cholera was not much interested in who did or did not deserve to have it, as bill-paying South Africans were soon taken down by the same germs that infected the Mozambicans and the Zimbabweans and the non-paying indigents. The claim to services here was granted, not as a matter of right, but of the inescapable pragmatics of presence. In another recent example, Jacob Doherty's work in Kampala shows us a different urban scene, one in which people are linked less by political integration as citizens or by economic integration in a system of production than via a kind of urban ecology of waste and disposability. Struggles over waste unfold in a context where both conventional electoral politics and labor-based mobilizations play a part, to be sure. But along with such familiar elements of African urban politics, Doherty foregrounds a set of distributive struggles that are not reducible to them. These involve the distribution of things that directly follow from physical co-presence, the distribution of medical risk, the distribution of the social stigma of waste and odor, the distribution of mobility with its pleasures and dangers across an overcrowded and contested landscape of urban transit. Low-income people are themselves often rendered a kind of waste in this cruel politics, suffering a socially constructed disposability, even as they, like some of Kampala's animal life, sometimes find niches within which they can not only survive, but even attain a kind of tainted flourishing amidst the filth. Here, the question of who gets what is decided through a visceral and intimate embodied politics of value and stigma, status and stench. Gabriel Hecht, meanwhile, offers an account of the political landscape left in the aftermath of the vast South African mining industry, an industry whose slow but steady decline has left behind a toxic archipelago of dumps and mine tailings that disrupt and endanger urban life across much of the country, and especially the densely populated Rand. Scholars of the region know, of course, that the old production apparatus of mining generated a range of powerful social identities and forms of political leverage. What we are now starting to see is that its toxic aftermath is generating very different ones, raising issues less of labor control and class formation, and more of co-use, proximity, and shared environmental vulnerability. After all, you don't have to be a mine worker to be affected by mining's toxic aftermath. And the map of vulnerability that this toxicity has created does not align well with the more familiar mappings of labor or citizenship. This means that even as we register the decline of a powerful and familiar form of left politics centered on working class mobilization, we must simultaneously face the challenge of analyzing the new configurations and political dangers and possibilities that are emerging in the aftermath of that decline. Here, as in the other brief examples I've given, the witnesses to the death of one kind of politics must interrupt their mourning to attend to the birth of another. In all of the cases I've mentioned, concrete questions of who gets what are worked out through embodied and spatialized practices enacted by people who have been thrown together into physical proximity, into a kind of shared co-presence. And these people typically engage in these practices not as authorized members of a pre-constituted social body, a nation, or a polity, but as participants in unintentional and often involuntary sorts of collectivity. Politics under these conditions, I have suggested, is less about abstract political membership and more about de facto co-usage and the pragmatic accommodations of co-presence. This is not, of course, to say that nations, citizenship, and legal rights somehow don't matter anymore, only that there is an emerging new vantage from which they may have less of a monopoly on the field of politics. The shift in perspective that I have so briefly tried to evoke, that is not a matter of throwing out wrong ideas and replacing them with right ones. It is rather a matter of developing new concepts and lines of sight that bring new objects and processes into view. A shift marked by the appearance of alternative analytical terms, such as presence, adjacency, accommodation, co-users, and so on. In conclusion, let me emphasize that I acknowledge that the modes of making distributive claims that I have discussed here may well not appear terribly potent in a world where the old constructs of labor and citizenship so often continue to dominate the conceptual landscape of distributive politics. But I would also insist that the forms of distribution that I have identified must be understood as emergent realities rather than utopian proposals. Universalistic payments based on the idea of popular ownership, for instance, to return to the first half of the paper, are not some utopian scheme, but already exist in a number of different forms. New social protection programs in several countries, for instance, link state-owned mineral resources directly to social entitlements, such as pensions and child care grants. In the US, we have the example of the Alaska Permanent Fund, which makes all legal residents of Alaska shareholders in a portion of the wealth produced by oil production there. Residents receive an annual dividend check based not on their participation in production, but their legal status as state residents, that is, as owners. And of course, similar arguments about the people's claim to the nation's mineral wealth have been drawn on quite effectively in Namibia's basic income grant campaign that I spoke of earlier. More broadly, the cash transfer schemes that have proliferated all across the global south in recent years are, it is true, still mostly conceived in a depoliticized social assistance frame. But as I suggested in Give a Man a Fish, drawing on Southern African experience, they may also be helping to lay the groundwork for new sorts of distributive politics that might help to move social payments away from the old grounds of charity and help for the helpless, and toward new conceptions that move in the direction of the rightful share. As for presence, here too, my approach is to track real developments on the ground, not to propose some imaginary pie in the sky. In fact, as I have emphasized here, the modern politics of state service delivery reveal the very real power of social claims based on presence. Which children should attend school? Who gets vaccinated for measles? Who gets toilets? The answers to questions like these often proceed not according to a logic of right, but of practical accommodation. Well, do we want undocumented kids not to be in school? What would happen then, and with what consequences? Do we really want to exclude a huge chunk of the population from our vaccination campaigns? Not legal abstractions, but brute sociological and immunological facts give the answers to such questions. Certain services must, for practical as much as ethical reasons, be extended not to whoever is an authorized member, but to whoever is here. And all over the world, new forms of political assertion and pragmatic accommodation draw their force not from the claims of citizenship, but those of presence. The problems of government that they present involve less adjudicating the rights belonging to members than coping with the material demands of what I have termed adjacency. Finally, I want to emphasize that it is not a matter of whether or not we should have new modes of distribution. The great and growing masses of people who lack both access to land and regular wage labor and the protections of legal citizenship are not going to meekly curl up in a corner and die. They will press their distributive claims using whatever channels and levers are near to hand. If the claims of labor and citizenship are not available to them, they will find other grounds for making distributive claims. And we will have to come to terms with new ways of thinking and new sorts of arguments. Arguments that, whether we like it or not, will disrupt our long-established ways of answering that old question, who gets what and why? Thank you.
Thank you for a fantastic lecture, and the floor is open for questions. I will take the order, so signal to me.
Should I just talk to the microphone?
Yes, yeah. I think.
Okay, that was a great talk. Thank you for coming and speaking. I do have a question, or a comment and a question. The first comment is yesterday New York City passed a law giving driver's license to undocumented immigrants, and like anybody who wants a driver's license can have one. So I think that's interesting in the context of your talk. And my question is, I wonder how you would orient the recent controversy over land redistribution in South Africa in terms of kind of like the white settler culture and the history of apartheid, and how all of that fits into this, because that seems to be where you've done a lot of your research and a lot of your model is based on your research there. So I'm wondering how that fits into your system you've described. Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much. Yes, your observation about the driver's license is quite interesting, I think. It's often at the national level that it's actually hardest to deal with the claims of the people who are merely here. I know in Southern California, where I used to live, the city of Santa Ana has municipal elections, and they let anyone who lives in Santa Ana vote in their municipal elections. You don't have to be a citizen of the United States to vote for the people who are going to represent you in your city, because you live in that city, and they're the ones who are representing you. The usual idea is, well, if you're not a citizen, obviously you don't get to vote. But why not? You're paying taxes, you're working, you're following the law, right? It's taxation without representation, as they used to say. But I think what it shows is that there's sometimes more room for an inventive politics beyond the nation-state form at the municipal level. And so there's some very interesting experiments going on at that time. As the land distribution thing in South Africa is a huge issue, and I have only a toe in the water of it. The place to begin, though, there's this idea, and it's a very powerful metaphor, is that the land is the national wealth, and therefore you're really going to the heart of the problem if you redistribute land. I always start by saying, actually, agriculture in South Africa is 3% of GDP and shrinking. So even if you were to redistribute every square hectare of agricultural land in South Africa, you would be leaving 97% of the economy untouched. Right? So it doesn't really go to the heart of things. And in fact, the symbolic demand for the land to be shared is enormously powerful. There's not actually that many people who are either equipped or interested in going out and farming it. It's a really hard thing to do to even break even farming in South Africa these days. So I think what we need to do is to change the way we understand what it is that needs to be redistributed, right? Instead of thinking that the economic production is fundamentally a physical process that involves using physical stuff like land and factories and so on. In a modern economy, that's a small share of the overall economy, right? Service industries are predominant. And so to really meaningfully get at a distributive politics, I think you have to go after income, and you have to have a way of linking that with taxation. And we're not used to doing that. I think particularly anthropologists, if you ask them, what theories of taxation do they work with, they give you a blank look, right? But we don't talk about taxation. But I think it's really important that we start to think about distributive politics in a way that is more sophisticated than what you usually see in discussions around land redistribution. Which is not to say that it wouldn't be a good thing to distribute some land.
1, 2.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I thought someone else. Thank you so much for this. This was really amazing. I really liked your mention of Kropotkin, just as a comment. I'm Professor Kropotkin's talking about birds and collective organizing, so just making some of I'm thinking about taking some of your broader conversations and bringing it a bit more local or close to home in a way, and I'm thinking about labor in university settings. And I'm also saying this as someone who actually works with the teaching assistant labor union on campus, so this is something that I think about all the time. But I'm wondering how to think about this idea of redistribution within a university setting, because sometimes academics, we go out, we do this great work, we present, and then sometimes we replicate these systems that we're critiquing at the same time. And I was just wondering if you had any sort of comments on that or ways that we might be able to take this thought and push it forward?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that's powerful about that very basic question, who gets what and why, is how scalable it is, right? Because you can ask that at any level of social organization and generate a really interesting set of questions. I think one of the things you see at the level of the politics of the university itself is the power of that labor framing, right? That we're used to thinking, if I'm going to argue that I deserve something, I'm going to almost have to ground it in either labor or citizenship, because there's nothing else. And sometimes you can do that. Sometimes you can bring graduate students out on strike as TAs and withhold their labor from the process of TAing. But a lot of what graduate students do isn't offering their labor in a commodity-like way. Often what you're doing is sitting at home writing your dissertations. And withholding your labor from that process doesn't bring the university to its knees, right? It just means it takes you longer to get your PhD. And so it can be very difficult. At Stanford, we have a problem because our students don't actually TA much. They would love to TA more. But they have nice graduate student fellowships that pay their way all the way through, right? So it's hard. They have grievances. They have claims. They have distributive arguments that are quite good. But it's hard for them to find a way to link them to the labor question, right? Because they're not fundamentally laborers. They have a different kind of social position. And I think we've got to be able to develop arguments about justice and exploitation that aren't just about labor, right? Because there's all kinds of other stuff, valuable stuff that people do in their social roles that you can't fit into that. I remember in South Africa hearing some good old style leftists talking about what to do with the hawkers, right? These people who sell stuff on the streets. And they're everywhere, and they're constantly trying to show you things that you should buy as you go down the street. And they said, well, if we could just get them organized, then we could just, threaten to withhold their labor. And I thought, really? Who is going to be, sort of brought to their knees by the thought that they might not have so many hawkers in their face as they're walking to their car? The predicament of the hawkers is really important and requires to be addressed through an effective politics, but it's not going to be one about withholding labor. It's going to have to be based on other kinds of claims.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you very much for a very thought-provoking talk. I have two quick questions. My first question relates to this idea of adjacency and presence. Is it merely physical, or is it extrapolated to something like the co-usage of, let's say, Facebook or WhatsApp? And how would we think about distribution at this level? And my second question relates to thinking about maybe the reverse side of the coin, which is accumulation in relationship to presence.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
I mean, obviously accumulation in relation to property and ownership and like primitive accumulation, I mean, those are in a very classical Marxist sense. Like, we're kind of used to thinking about those things, but in terms of like presence, and it's not very developed in my mind, so I'm sorry if it doesn't come out very clear. But for instance, in the case of like co-usage of Facebook, for instance, like data is concentrated somewhere, wealth is accumulated somewhere, and this can be extrapolated to so many other different things. I don't know.
Yes. Okay. So the question of, is presence simply as a matter of let's say, literal physical presence? The answer is no. One of the things I'm trying to push for is that we need as richly constructed an understanding of presence as we currently have of membership. Whereas you can appeal to a kind of common sense with membership and say, oh, people like us. But what is that? What makes you like me? What makes people cohere as a group of people who are somehow united by being the same people? We know that's an extraordinarily complicated thing. Enormous amounts of cultural and historical work go into creating those common sense understandings. But we need to do the same with ideas of here, right? What does it mean to to see people as inhabiting the same space as you. And often it is about the sort of national fetishization of space. So I remember when we had these hurricanes in Florida, and people were saying, well, you know, we have to look after people in Florida. After all, there are people. It's right here in the USA. But it's actually not very. If I'm in California, it's not close to me at all in a literal sense, and yet it's right here in the USA, right? That move that enables some places to be spontaneously apprehendable as right here is one of the things we have to think about more carefully. You also raised the question, which I think is an enormous one, and we have not yet done a very good job of thinking about it. Is what kind of, in what ways does the sort of virtual presence of being on shared social networks produce the same effects or not as physical presence does. And there, I think that's an empirical question. I mean, that's the sort of thing we have to go out and look at. It clearly makes some difference, right? I mean, if you read in the newspaper in a little article on page 17 that a bunch of people in Syria were killed last week, that doesn't have the same effect as if you're Facebook friends with somebody who's being killed, right? And we've seen a lot of that sort of firsthand, almost firsthand witnessing of horrific acts of violence that were mediated through the computer. So that's powerful stuff, but we don't yet know quite what to make of it. It's not the same as being there physically, but it's not wholly different either. I think that's an extremely interesting set of questions. On the accumulation and capital stuff, I think we should be careful not to be too quick to accept this idea that capitalism is infinitely mobile and not attached to place and just sort of moves through electrical wires. And it's not the case. I mean, it is institutionalized in the major institutions of the banking industry in particular, and we could do a lot more to regulate and tax through our control over those institutions if we would pay enough attention to do it.
There are a lot of hands.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for this fascinating talk. And having read through your work, I'm tracking your ideas to a number of other places that you have fertilized, like the work on boundaries and, in effect, deconstructing the notion of nations and peoples. And I see that coming back in this talk. I wanted to just touch on the issue of presence, which I've interpreted in some sort of quite abstract notion as coming from Derrida, and the whole notion of presence as representing something that is foundational in terms of our understanding of institutions or meaning. And you seem to be flipping that upside down, because effectively what you're carrying out that critique, which we once associated with deconstruction, in saying, do we really have a basis in nation or blood or soil or labor for deducing what one group or another person really deserves? And you're basically saying, no, we don't have that. It's not there.
Yes, in a way it's a kind of a false clue to use the word presence insofar as there are readers who will immediately associate that with Derrida. I have a long footnote explaining that what I mean is actually not what Derrida means, and my argument is, if anything, as you say, sort of going the other direction, that there are presence is not just this kind of refusal to accommodate difference, as Derrida would have it, but something that requires its own political as well as semiotic analysis. And I think he doesn't really think much about what presence actually is. It's just a kind of foil for him against which to contrast this kind of textualized difference that he celebrates.
Just one more point.
Yeah.
I liked your evocation of Kropotkin. I've come to believe that anthropology is a type of anarchist discipline because of our posture in the world and our perspective. We basically look at the world from a community level, and we look up at the state, while the political scientists look from the state down. And in that regard, I think many of the points that you were evoking, what is it, how do people gather themselves together, form alliances, see affinities in such a way that they can then make claims which you've described in terms of distribution. And it seems to me that we have a lot of ingredients for carrying out investigations and theorizing from that perspective.
Yeah, I have a mixed stance toward the anthropological inheritances of anarchism. On the one hand, it is one of the major sources of radical social thought that didn't get absorbed into Marxism-Leninism, and therefore preserves some of that intellectual vitality and diversity that we had in the very early years of the 20th century and late years of the 19th, when socialism meant many things and there was all kinds of stuff going on, and then suddenly, after 1917, it goes shrunk, and it all gets shrunk into this thing called Marxism. I started thinking about some of this stuff, reading about Marcel Mauss and his milieu. And his socialism, which was, of course, very different from Marxian socialism, but it was a very serious socialism. He knew what he meant by the word. So yes, I want to give respect to these other traditions of radical social thought, and anarchism is one of the really important streams. At the same time, I think the kind of distributive politics I'm interested in presumes a bureaucratically capable state apparatus that's capable of doing things like sending everybody a check once a month. And that is why I'm puzzled by anarchists who support those kinds of distributive goals, but who don't support the means necessary to will them into existence. I could mention David Graeber, who is a big exponent of basic income and thinks basic income is great, we should all have it, and hates bureaucracy in all of its forms and we should never tolerate it. And we have to have an awfully optimistic understanding of spontaneously self-organizing human communities to suppose that they're going to be able to instantiate those kinds of. So I think what you need is a kind of social theory which takes on the need for the state in some form and for effective bureaucracy as a condition of a modern system of distribution, but that also is willing to learn from people like Kropotkin. I mean, a lot of what Kropotkin said is dead wrong. If you look at his account of what happens after the revolution, for instance, it's this fantasy. It's a fairy tale kind of story about how the intrinsically good workers will all band together and work in the common interest, and they will gather all the goods together and hold them in storehouses and fairly distribute them. This is all going to happen by itself somehow. But he also has a very interesting and very convincing kind of critique of capitalism on a kind of distributive justice basis that's very different from Marx's. So I want to keep both sides of that.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Ferguson. I really do appreciate the sort of the field and practical aspects of your research when it comes to really asking the question of who gets what and why. And but there's another question that I don't know under this context is how do we get it? Is when we think about how when we are discussing who gets what and why do they get it, but who gets the things that, like, how do we acquire and attain the things that are supposed to be distributed in the beginning? And I I used to work as a nutrition advisor for an NGO in Ethiopia, focusing on children under 5 and pregnant and laboring women. Yes. And the topic of distribution really reminds me of one of the most difficult parts of my job is to, when I'm distributing nutritional supplements to mothers, I have to tell, let's say the mother has 5 children, I have to tell the mother to only feed the 2 children that are severely malnutrition. So how do I, like, in these contexts of distribution and who gets what and why, how do I persuade a mother on how have I gotten these nutritional supplements in the first place, and how can she only feed 2 of her 5 children who for her, all of them are starving at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a tough situation to be in. The point of my analysis is not to provide answers to those kinds of questions. It's to point to the importance of a kind of field within which distributive questions get answered. And my stance is not that I have some formula that will tell us how distributive questions should be answered, but that I've identified some sites where the politics that settles those questions is in fact worked out, right? That what this opens up onto is not a set of prescriptions, but a field of politics. And within that field of politics, those distributive questions are inevitably answered. They're not always answered in the way that we would like. But that's where you need to go to look, right? And if you want different answers to be emergent, it's going to have to be as a result of something happening at the level of that field of political play, because that's where the answers are actually, the decisions about who gets what and why are actually made.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. So I like cash payments, direct cash payments, and the notion of universal income. At the same time, I wonder about the cultural and social consequences in the long term. Historically, I think the answer that has been given to the fact that we increase how much we can get from the same amount of labor was sharing labor. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we worked more, now we work 40 hours a week, but that's still a lot. And so if we engage now in that other option, instead of reducing labor per person as a way to adjust, don't we lose the chance to move one step ahead in that direction? Because 40 hours is still a lot, and working less would mean more time for family life, community life. So there's still a big area of progress in that direction. So if we engage now instead in that other direction, by accepting some people are not involved in labor and receive income on another justification, isn't that an excuse for not advancing more in terms of sharing the labor more equally?
Yeah, that's. I think that's an issue that gets posed a lot in first world economies, where there is this history of having legislated work weeks, and therefore the possibility of saying, why 40, why not 35, why not 30, sharing the jobs, as you say. The issues posed very differently in the places where I've worked, where first of all the number of hours in a day that people work is not regulated. It's a matter of what opportunities they're able to track down and how long they're willing to put in. It's also the case that the kind of cash payments that I'm talking about are not payments that allow you to work less. They're not. You can't live on what you're getting in cash transfers. They're more likely to be things that enable you to do more, actually. They'll enable you to be economically active when you might have not been able to be economically active through sheer destitution or poverty. So, if you don't have enough money to get transit into town, for instance, you're very unlikely to go and find a job in town. So giving people little bits of money is understood as a way of enabling them to pursue a wider range of livelihood strategies. So it's quite different. It's also the mismatch between the kinds of jobs that are available in an economy like South Africa and the kind of people who need the jobs is such that you can't just share the existing jobs, right? The people who need the jobs don't have anything like the credentials that they would need to share in the jobs that are there. So I feel there's a kind of mismatch between these two different discourses, which often happens with basic income, right? Because you have a single policy program that's being backed in many different places in the world where the economic context is so very different that it actually means quite different things. That they had an election for basic income in Switzerland, I think it was. And the basic income was supposed to provide, I forget what, it was like $4,000 a month or something. The basic income that's proposed in Namibia was about $15 US a month. Right. So it's not even remotely the same thing, although we call it the same thing.
Thank you for this exciting talk.
So I find it really interesting to think about the kind of practices of sharing and accommodation that you're tracking at local scales through this prism of presence. But I'm wondering whether that's not taking presence a little too thinly, insofar as presence, in a sense, is always also interpolated through other frames. If you just think about Benedict Anderson and The Nation, that's also a presence. It's an imagined presence. It's an imagined co-temporality, simultaneity that people share, right?
It's a simultaneity, but it's same time, not necessarily same space.
Not well, same national space, right? Same national space, and tied to particular framings of what is legitimate presence. And so this brings me to my question.
Okay.
One direction in which we can think presence is in the direction of tolerance and sharings due to shared risks, for instance, in bodily politics that you're outlining. Another direction or another way of thinking about presence is, of course, through its antithesis, which is politics of exclusion. And if you're looking at the United States, that's the direction that presence has been taking politically. If you're looking at the DRC in the 1990s, that's the direction that presence has been taken politically, toward a politics of indigeneity and exclusion. So I'm wondering whether you would talk a little bit about that antithesis to the antithesis to this politics of the presence that you're describing, which we could maybe think about as a politics of indigeneity that frames presence as legitimate or illegitimate.
Well, indigeneity is about membership in my accounts. Presence messes up the nice, clean lines that are asserted in the politics of indigeneity, where you say, look, we are this people, we belong to this place belongs to this people, we draw a line around it, it's ours. And then you come along and say, well, actually, but there's a bunch of people here who are not members of your ethnic group who live in that territory. What about their rights, right? So exclusion is certainly always present, but I don't think that it's intrinsic to the idea of focusing on presence as opposed to membership. I think on the contrary, it's an assertion of the claims of membership in the face of physical circumstances that transgress them. When you look at the sort of politics of xenophobia and exclusion and so on that are so much a part of what we read in the newspapers these days, it seems to me that is precisely a sort of testament to the power of presence. That is, people know that whatever claims they may have as human beings in some abstract form, when they're in Mauritania, are far weaker than those same claims would be if they can get to Italy, right? Why? Well, because when you get to Italy, you're here, right? You physically have to be dealt with. Somebody has to do something with you after you wash up on the beach, right? You can't just look the other way and ignore it. And so one of the reasons people keep coming, one of the reasons people keep running such extraordinary risks and paying such extraordinary costs to enter these spaces of in-migration is precisely because they know how much difference it makes, right? How much presence actually matters in these determinations. Yep.
So I'm thinking a little bit of Bianca Dahl's work in Botswana about HIV/AIDS orphans, in which by virtue of having lost your parents and your family to this disease, you get access to commodities that you might not otherwise have access to through international development projects. And this has created a certain conundrum because basically people have begun to contest this idea of who gets what, no longer as an idea that these people are deserving of aid, but as these people are receiving almost too much aid, or aid that is now unfair or exclusive. Yeah. So I'm wondering how we contest these ideas of who gets what and why, when it's not a question of a handout for somebody who needs help, quote unquote, but it is a contestation based on the idea that you have too much or that you're receiving too much.
Well, I think those things go together. That is, as soon as you start deciding some people deserve to get this and other people don't, then there are going to be people who feel that you've made the wrong determination, or that they're pretending to be poor but they're not really, or they're pretending to be disabled but they're not, or they're disabled but they're not that disabled. Why are they getting so much more than the rest of us? And so on. And it tends to fracture the class of recipients of payments and turn them against the rest of the community. It's one of the reasons why I am a fan of universal basic income on an unconditional basis, because it doesn't make those distinctions. Often it's a way of reintroducing a logic of deservingness that doesn't flow from a kind of notion of common ownership, but flows from an idea of these are people who are diminished, and therefore, because they're orphans or because they're disabled or whatever, we must feel sorry for them. And it draws on this old Christian idea of charity and so on, which is still quite deeply entrenched in places like Botswana. And I think it's one of the reasons why I think before you say, oh, cash transfer programs are great, you have to look at what is the cash transfer program, how does it work, and what are the sort of premises and assumptions that it's making, because some of them are not so great at all. But I think the real answer is the empirical one, and Dick Salisbury would be proud of me. Go and look, right? I mean, you can't answer these questions in the abstract. You've got to actually go out there and do the research.
Thank you so much for the talk. I'm really taken by the term presence as a kind of, because it's kind of an entitlement to a rightful share. But I think what is an important aspect of presence, and if we use it politically, is how presence comes to bear or how does it not to. So I think I'm also talking to a couple of questions that have been in the room. And I think by analyzing this, by qualifying this, how this is happening, this is maybe how we get back to a kind of anarchic optimism in a way. So I was thinking about the vegetable garden in your example. So it does matter, and there is a how to why in some places neighbors completely see that it's normal to take somebody that would otherwise be selfish to keep. In other places, you don't have the assurance of kind of the community's taking it as a good move, taking it as a rightful move to take somebody's too much vegetables. And I think these are questions of how that can be asked, and it can also be like ethnographically documented. I think that's important. So how is it possible that in some cases a presence does become a ground for claims for a rightful share, and how in other places it is rightful to accumulate vegetables while others don't. And the second aspect, maybe that's more of is when I think of presence, it's something about sensuality, like somebody is like visible, or it doesn't have to be visible by sight, but recognizable. So I think a big part of the politics of presence would be a politics of visibility or invisibility, and how people are made unpresent in them being made unseen. And I'm thinking of precarious migration, of landscapes of invisibilized violence and migration. And I wonder how you think about how presence comes to bear in your work.
Yes, let me start with the second, because that's very close to the themes of the talk. This is part of what I mean when I say present. We have to make presence the object of a critical analytics, not just something that is naturally found in the world. And of course, one of the things you know if you read the ethnography of abject categories of people is that people are very good at not seeing them at all. And there are often a bunch of social institutions that facilitate something that is, in fact, literally, physically present, failing to be recognized as present at all. And you can think of the way gated communities segregate the rich from the experiences of the poor people who are right there. I mean, right there, maybe 100 yards away, but they put a hedge in a certain position and they put a gate here, and so you don't have to notice that they're right there. So recognition, presence always involves this question of recognition, I think, that it just as membership does. So that it's not just a question, is the person present physically or are they not, but is their physical presence recognized as a legible presence? And again, that's an eminently researchable topic. As for when and how presence matters, you're right to call attention to that, because it doesn't always matter. Right? It's not at all the case that simply by being present you get your claims responded to. In fact, probably more often you don't. But I think you have to understand when those claims are responded to, it's out of some kind of obligation. Right? it's not just ethical people sitting there pondering, what shall I do for the poor today? And that's just not what happens most of the time. If sharing is a social obligation, then we have to understand under what circumstances is it obligatory, right? Obligations are obligatory. You don't do them because you're a nice person. You do them because you have to. And we have to analyze the circumstances that make it such that somebody has to share, like the ethnographer in my example, rather than decide that because she's a kind person, she's going to share. She realized that given the way things were laid out, she had no choice. She had to do it. It was obligatory. I want to talk about social obligation in that strong sense, which is also a very classically anthropological sense, right? I mean, one of the things the old ethnographers taught us was that social norms are enforced by sanctions, and if you go around breaking them, something bad's going to happen to you, right? People are very attentive to that when they live in village communities, for instance. Yeah, both questions that are very close to the heart of the paper. Thank you.
We're reaching the end of our session. The last two questions, very quickly. Yeah, you, please. No, you. Wait.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. So I was wondering whether we could expand on the boundaries of ownership, because conceptually you seem to imply that it can apply to everyone on a global scale. But the example you gave mostly take place within given countries. And different countries are endowed differently with resources to redistribute. So I'm just wondering whether this concept of ownership can address global inequalities. And I was also wondering how you engage with ideas by Peter Singer, who says that global redistribution should be considered at a global level rather than a national one. And I'm asking this question partly because we can see increased shared physical presence both as a principle through which we can redistribute resources, but also as a consequence of global inequalities, which push people to migrate to other countries.
Yes, thank you. Kropotkin imagined the common ownership that he outlined as being planetary. He's very clear about that. The creation of the modern apparatus of production involved all parts of the world. And therefore the ownership claim, he said, for practical as well as moral reasons has to be understood as owed to everyone. But as I pointed out, the kind of politics of distribution that you can identify in the real world these days are almost entirely nation-state based and not planet-wide. And that's one of the reasons why I said we're going to need something in addition to the logic of national membership as a basis for distributive claims, right? If you were interested in distributive claims at a higher level, or as you say, the inequalities among nations, which are formidable, then we're going to have to find ways of crediting things other than membership as grounding distributive claims. And this is where I think presence is one of the most interesting such alternatives. It's by no means the only one. I think we're going to see, we already are seeing, we will see more a proliferation of kinds of distributive claims. Right? People who come and say, not just, I need to be paid because I worked a certain number of hours, or I need to be paid because I'm a citizen, but people who say, I need to be paid because I'm a steward of the environment in this environmentally sensitive area, or I need to be paid because we have a historic wrong against my people and we need redress in the form of what do you call it? There's a word for it when you... Reparations, yes, reparation. And so on and so on and so on, right? I mean, it's not a list that's in principle bounded. There's all kinds of grounds on which you can make distributive claims. And I think those other grounds are going to become more and more important when you're dealing with populations of people who don't have labor-based claims and maybe don't have citizenship-based claims. So we shall see.
Very last question. Then, of course, you're all invited to the reception upstairs to continue the conversation. Please.
Thank you very much for a thought-provoking lecture. I was wondering if you could further expand on the role of multi-locational dwelling in this reconceptualization of belonging, well, of membership and of presence. I am thinking here of seasonal workers from Mexico who come to Canada, and there are regimes between the government of Canada and Mexico in which there's a recognition based on, but it's still based on labor, right? As long as they labor, they are recognized in this way, but it's still precarious. So with this in mind, and perhaps also with people that are displaced, my question is, what is the role of temporality and what is the role of change across nations in this reconceptualization?
Yes. Well, you raise a good point, because I think in some of these discussions where we talk about the sort of shrinking role of stable wage labor, there's a tendency to kind of romanticize the old days and to act like, oh, back in the old days when people had these jobs, you know. Well, in Southern Africa, those old days were called apartheid, and the jobs that people had were jobs that locked them into the migrant labor system, where they had no rights at all in the places where they worked. And as soon as they got sick or injured, they got kicked out and sent back home to wherever they were deemed to belong. So the kind of incorporation that came through labor was often not very pleasant, not at all satisfactory, not at all egalitarian. It is often remembered as better than what came after it, which tells you something, right? When people are nostalgic for the migrant labor system and apartheid. But we should not give in to that kind of romanticization of a remembered past. Those issues are still very much with us, right? Because we have not by any means moved into a world beyond wage labor. We depend on wage labor all the time for things like the food on our plates. But what you see is those old mechanisms that were so well documented in the South African case are being used all over the world to shed costs, right? To dump as many of the costs as possible on the sending communities, and to accept only the bare minimum of costs that are necessary for people when they're young and healthy and working. And that dynamic, I know it well from California. It seems to be alive and well. It's, I think, another reason why it's such bad politics to make people's political rights conditional on their citizenship. Right? If you could instead give more emphasis to presence, to residence, and say, look, you know, the political system has to be here for the people who live under it, right? To the people who live here. And that in itself would make it much easier for people who are exploited in workplace environments to push back, to have some recourse. And currently they're quite frighteningly without recourse in many cases.
We have a very last question.
Okay.
On behalf of Dick Salisbury's family, may I say what an honor it's been to be present here at the reboot of this lecture series. And let me just say thank you to Professor Ferguson for setting such a high standard for future lecturers, to the Dean and to Setrag and Colin for your generous words about my father at the beginning, to the Faculty of Arts for its support of this rebooted series, to Setrag and especially Colin for the hard work in actually making this a reality, to Sarah for helping spark the idea of this series at the beginning, to Annie for the amazing display upstairs, and may I just say, we are all looking forward to getting home and sharing this amazing experience with my mother, who at 93 couldn't travel here, but she certainly wished she could have. So thank you all very, very much.